And a very good afternoon on behalf of everybody associated with the NADP Analytical Laboratory. Thank you for taking time to continuing series of webinars today entitled Aerochem Collector, Motorbox, and Sensor Data Dribble Site Support. I'm joined today by Chris Lehman, Director of the Central Analytical Laboratory, as well as Data Manager within the program office. Today we want to give you a little feedback on changing motor boxes as you progress into the winter time. Over the years, if you've operated and been a site operator, you know that how the freezing rain and the snow can play havoc with our collectors. So today we thought we'd give you a little hands-on as we progress in this. If you have any questions, if this is the first time you've joined us, you can go to goillinois.edu NADP training. There's also going to be a link to the memo that we actually send out. If we send you a motor box, there will be a description on how to go step by step for changing the motor box.
You don't have a mic. Oh, okay. That's why that one's off. And that's why it's really
Okay. Are we better now? Okay, let's try this again. Once again, very good afternoon. We were talking a little bit about, I thought the microphone was on. We're working with two microphones, so our apologies. But this afternoon's webinar is entitled Aerochem Collector, Motorbox, and Sensor Replacement. We want to talk about this at this time of year because of the weather and how weather can play havoc with the motorbox and the sensor and the Aerochem collector. So as we progress through this, we're going to talk a little troubleshooting, very little troubleshooting, but we want you to also understand that once we've gotten to this point of changing out the box and the sensor, that we've had an opportunity to go through some of the troubleshooting. What you're going to see in one of these slides, if this is the first time you've had an opportunity to join us for our webinars, you can go to goillinois.edu/NADP training and catch some of our past webinars, or if you want to review this one again and you have questions at any point, don't hesitate to stop us. We'll read the question. We'll try to answer it to the best of our ability. Or if we can help you down the line with something that your particular site is incurring, then don't hesitate to share that with us as well. What happens in, say, Florida on an Aerochem collector may not be something that happens in Wyoming or Colorado with an Aerochem collector. So if you can share with us, that's a learning tool for all of us involved. Next slide, Brian. Items needed for a motor box replacement. Replacement motor box, obviously. Small and medium-sized straight blade screwdriver and small and medium-sized Phillips head screwdriver. We have those adjustable screwdrivers that we'll show you at some point. If you need one, let us know. We can send you one. It's very helpful to have that little screwdriver in your mix for being able to adjust a pair of pliers, a small adjustable wrench, 7/16 wrench, or a socket. Important in removing the clutch bolt away from the motor box and making sure that you do not strip it. The last one I'm not a big fan of. You can do it, but if you do not have it, then you can make notes. But a lot of times we ask operators to leave their field observer report form back in the laboratory, and you can make notice to what's going on in the remarks section, section 10 of your field form when you get back to the lab. Next slide, please. As I was saying, the highlighted part there, motor box replacement SOP. If you click on that, you're going to see the very attachment memo that we send out when we do send a motor box. We normally send an email. If you don't have email, then we will send a hard copy, but that's a step-by-step tutorial on to go about changing the motor box and the sensor, but we're also going to do it here today as well. Precautions to take. Familiarize yourself when we're going about troubleshooting to see and making the determination as to whether we should change a box or a sensor. Familiarize yourself with the front of the motor box and the type of power you use. So when I make a comment or I ask you a question, then we can make a determination. If you use AC power, first and foremost, disconnect the power to the collector, unplug the motor box power cord. If you use DC, it will be disconnected in a subsequent step. Be careful not to drop or misplace the screws. A lot of times when you're working in snow or the grass or something, the screws aren't very big. You drop them, and then you're in big trouble. Always record, once again, comments in block 10, the remarks section of the Field Observer Report form, and always contact Cal if you have any questions or need any assistance. Familiarizing yourself with the front of the motor box, just everything that you need to know. Like I said, AC fuse, the event recorder fuse, and we'll talk a little bit about maybe testing some voltages and stuff like that after we've gotten the motor box swapped out. But there again, familiarize yourself with it. Use caution in doing so, and if there's any questions, and stop us and we can talk about that. One of the things, I'm going to stop right here. We're going to get into the live part of this now. This slide here is just a picture of the clutch, and we're going to talk about how the clutch actually works in helping the motor box to operate properly. As I said, I'm joined by Dr. Chris Lehman, Director of the Central Analytical Laboratory. We're going to do a little bit of hands-on. When you come to your site, we're going to go to the live shot of the collector that we put together. This is a mock-up collector that we use in training. What we've done is cut the side out of it, and it would be oh so effective if every operator had that in making repairs. But then again, it also snow or whatever type of precipitation can get up underneath there, as well as those dandy wasp and mice and whatever else may be. So as I talk through this, Chris is we're going to work on and changing a motor box. So I welcome him into the webinar today.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I hadn't changed a webinar until we did our rehearsal yesterday, so this was really my first experience. I was always kind of in fear that going out to the field and tackling it, and it's actually pretty straightforward. The first precaution that we talked about is we want to disconnect the power from the collector. We're not going into troubleshooting today. As Jeffrey mentioned, we have prior webinars where we talk about how to use an electrical multimeter and how to troubleshoot the equipment. So we'd refer you back to that, or go ahead and call us. We just want to focus on the actual changing of the motor box. And as Jeffrey noted, we have the side of the collector open for visual, so I'll fight the urge to reach in the side. And it is a little awkward. I would suggest, if you can, take a colleague to the field site. You can do it by yourself. I'm going to demonstrate how you can do that. But it goes a little faster and smoother if you happen to have a colleague available or a friend who could come out to the site with you quickly. The first thing we want to do is disconnect the power. We have established that the motor box is bad here, so the first thing I'm going to do is unplug it.
As part of the initial troubleshooting, we do ask that if you're running off AC power, that you do take your voltmeter and make a determination as to the outlet where you're plugging your motor box into is working properly.
Yeah, and if you had DC power, now's the time where you'd go ahead and reach under the collector and disconnect the power leads from there. As Jeffrey mentioned, we have a handy 4-in-1 screwdriver that has all the bits you need. We'll supply these for you if you need one. One thing that will be helpful, though, that's required to change the motor box, I'd suggest either a box end wrench or a socket set, socket wrench at 7/16 inch. It makes it much easier to handle. Before we begin, we would want to go ahead, we do have a wet side bucket in here. You'd want to go ahead and remove and secure the wet side bucket, decant your sample, process it as normally. Go ahead and note on the field form if there are any issues during the sampling week that could affect the validity of that sample. So that would be the first step we'd want to do before we change it. Today, though, we're just going to focus on changing the motor box. You need to go ahead and remove the dry side bucket because there's a screw in the top of the motor box you'll need to access. So I'll just go ahead and remove this. This would be a good time to swap that out or to change the lip of that, to clean that and go ahead and do your monthly maintenance. But for right now, I'm just going to remove it. The first step, and actually the key step we found, is you want to disconnect the arm from the motor box. You can see it here. Obviously, you won't be able to see it with the side in your collector, but you want to remove the 7/16 head hex nut. We'll refer you to the diagram if you have questions about what's there. Basically, this nut links the clutch of the Motorbox to the armature and linkage that Jeffrey will be talking about in a little bit when we talk about some problems and checks for troubleshooting your collector. So I'm just going to reach in and remove that nut.
When you get, sorry, Chris, when you get a new Motorbox, what you're going to be doing is removing that old bolt off of the side of the armature of the old Motorbox. Make sure that you're aware of how that comes off. The bushings and the spacing is very imperative to making sure that that's tied up against the clutch going to the Motorbox and will allow the collector to cycle without any interference. And the way Chris did was when you get your new Motorbox, it will be the way that it needs to actually go on once you install it.
And I was about to say that, yes. So go ahead and install that on there. Switch your screwdriver to be the large end. You want a large head. And what's probably easiest is to first remove the one that's inside the dry side bucket. And again, I realize we're inside. Everything goes nicely inside. When you're outside, you've got blowing snow in there. Use some precaution that you don't lose those. We usually just try to leave the screws on the top of the collector. We found it helps to do diagonals first. So I'm going to remove the diagonally opposite one. And notice I'm right-handed, so I'm going to do the screw with my right hand, holding the screwdriver, my left hand kind of bracing that Motorbox. There's 4 screws there, 1 inside the dry side, 1 diagonally opposite, and then 2 on the other diagonal. And then this is where it becomes the challenge because it doesn't weigh a lot. It's what, about 10 or 12 pounds, but this is where you may wish to have a colleague, and I'm just holding this here. And
the part where it drops is not that big a deal. It's the part that it goes back up that is a little bit more tedious.
Yeah. And one thing you want to do before you do completely drop it, I realize we got ahead of ourselves. You'll want to go ahead and disconnect the sensor. As I was feeling around, I reached that. You want to disconnect your power and your sensor lead. Otherwise, when you did remove it, you would find it was tethered. That's just a quick screw connector.
At this point, I'm going to step in the picture and give him a little extra hand if necessary.
Am I looking desperate, Jeffrey?
Not yet.
Am I looking in need of assistance? I might be soon. Nothing's ever as easy on live camera.
And like we talked about, this is going to drop all of a sudden.
All right.
I mean, try to balance it best you can.
And the last one probably doing your near thing so you can kind of hold it close to you. All right. And here's where the help of a colleague might be there. And thank you, colleague. All right. Will we try not to drop it?
And we've got the old one off of there, and that cord is awful handy as far as being able to grab it. Try not to grab the cord. We don't want to break anything on the Motorbox, although it doesn't work, so I guess that's not a real big deal. But putting the new one back on, try to avoid the cord as much as possible. But as we've taken this old Motorbox off, you can see it's been in the field for quite some time. The internals switching and stuff like that is, the determination of what went wrong with it. We can let you know about later when you send it back to us and we have an opportunity to work on it.
Yeah, and just to note, we don't, all the Motorboxes we have in our system for the ACM, that's Aerochem Metrics type collector, are refurbished. So we ask you to return the parts to us. The reason we do that is we will refurbish it and send it to new sites. So please do return it to us. Your site pays a maintenance fee that pays for basically the refurbishing of all equipment. We have the new Motorbox.
See how pretty and clean it is? But it's also, it comes from us, and when you get it, it's been through our shop technician. He's had an opportunity to look at everything, make sure everything on the Motorbox works. AC fuse, event recorder fuse, DC fuse, just make sure that those are nice and tight and in. They are going through the shipping system, so I know that things get bounced around and stuff like that. Make sure that you have your armature connector on the side. That's just like the one that you just took off, and then all systems go as far as putting the new one on.
The Motorbox should be good as you receive it. And as Jeffrey noted, go ahead and leave that nut there. I'm going to try to do this by myself again to demonstrate how you can do that. You'll want to hold it probably in two hands with the clutch facing away from you, and probably do this near diagonal hole first, the one that's right inside of the dry side bucket, so you can sight where the hole is. One important thing is you don't want to tighten the screws all the way until we have it fully installed, and we'll show you why in a minute. So just go ahead and finger tighten so you have good engagement of those two diagonal screws. And then do the third one between the dry and wet side. And then finally, the fourth one that's under what would normally be the dry side bucket. So we're going to leave this loose. We want a little bit of maneuvering room, and the reason for that is we still have to hook the armature up. Again, you can either use a socket wrench or a box end wrench. Now this is the tricky part always. You want to remove this. It helps have your hand underneath it to catch it. There is a bushing and a couple washers there. Hold that good. And then what you want to do, this can be tricky, is to line up the hole in your armature linkage. Again, I realize you won't have the benefit of this nice open collector. You'll have to look up from below. And we want to make sure we don't have cross threading. So as you can see, I'm doing my best to line the hole up with that nut, hex nut, and it should go on smoothly. If you have any resistance, it's most likely cross-threaded, as this one seems to be. And in our practice yesterday, we also found this to be one of the more challenging things. So I will engage my colleague. Thank you, Jeffrey.
This is where colleagues come in handy.
Yeah.
And what's real important, once again, as Chris said earlier, and we talked about earlier, is getting that bushing connector back onto the armature correctly and having the correct amount of spacing.
And we even practiced on this Motorbox yesterday, and of course it went fine, didn't it? Yes.
It always does.
Always does in fine in practice.
There we go. Go ahead and give her a tidy.
Yeah, we can't even say we'll go to a commercial break and then have it miraculously connected when we get back.
Okay, we got her now.
Yeah.
But it's easy to say. I mean, you can sit there and look at this and say these two fools are having trouble doing this, but this is a really tedious process. I mean, you got to understand, we have this problem inside, not to mention all the efforts that the poor operators laying on their back in a snowdrift or during what may be occurring to swap one of these out. That's what we call real important about the troubleshooting process. The last thing we really want to do is have to change one of these, but if we do, then you can see how to go.
Yeah, so as you can see, that's probably the most challenging step. It's very straightforward, except just lining up that little bit. And so our best tip there is to just finger tighten these just enough so the Motorbox can hang there. And then now that we're fully engaged, I'm just going to brace it with my left hand and just go ahead and finish screwing those in tight, just hand tight. You don't want to overstrip it. And again, thank you to all you operators out there that go do this in the field in the snow every week. We appreciate your efforts. So tighten those 4 screws. And one good thing to check, the lid should be engaged. We'll talk about the clutch and its purposes in just a minute. At this point, we would go ahead and reconnect our DC power and our event recorder to the rain gauge and reconnect the sensor. After we finish with this step with Motorbox, we'll go through how to replace a sensor. It's actually very straightforward. And often, if we aren't exactly sure with the issues of the site, we may send you a sensor Motorbox pair, so just be aware. We may actually tell you to switch both of them at once.
What's real important and what happens is if you have one component, say, if you have a sensor or a motor box that's bad, as Chris was saying, a lot of times we'll send both components because of the switching issue inside the motor box. If you have a bad motor box and a good sensor, put the two together, they cross-contaminate each other, and then it's best a lot of times just to replace both components, and that's the way we do it a lot of times.
Okay, at this point, we want to test. I plugged the collector back in again. We want to go ahead and wet the sensor, just a drop of water, or what a great test in winter is put a little snow on there, and it opens. So success.
And like I said, we're real lucky with the side of this collector being cut out. So what you want to look at when you're initially make the collector open, and once again, once you get to this point, we want to make sure that we don't have any buckets on the collector. We do not want to put the wet collection or the new sample bucket on the collector until we make sure that everything is working properly. What's real important to look at once you've tightened your armature to the side of your brand new motor box is to watch how it rotates. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth in that to make sure that there's no hangups between the collector closing and opening. And we'll, like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily.
All right, do you want to talk at this point about counterweights and troubleshooting? I'm going to go ahead and
there's a couple
dry
items.
that sensor.
There's a couple items that I want to make sure everybody's aware of. And like I said, I don't want to get too detailed about troubleshooting, but when you look underneath, and let me find the particular slide that's important here on, I'll have Brian go through our slides here real quick. Go to the undercarriage. It's the one called Motorbox Aerochem Replacement. It shows the undercarriage of the motor box or of the collector itself. On the bottom picture, you can see the clutch bolt, the clutch, the AC power cord, the motor box, sensor, cable, and all. What's real important to look at is the top picture. Familiarize yourself. What I'm holding and what is not on this particular collector is the counterweight. It's listed right there. What needs to happen for the collector to be able to cycle properly is for the counterweight and the push rod in conjunction with your drive rods need to be at a 90-degree angle. On either side of the push rod, and I can explain a little bit more in detail if you want to know about this, is there's a clip on either side of those drive rods, and the counterweight should sit in a particular spot as well as the push rod. If those clips have moved ever so slightly, what happens is that push rod or that counterweight will move up and down that drive rod shaft, and as the collector rotates, it hangs up. So it's real important if we're incurring issues to where you say, oh, the collector's kind of hanging up on me, the motor's working fine, I may ask for you to take a picture and look at what we've got going on underneath. It'll alleviate having to replace a motor box, but a lot of times, as old as these collectors are, those clips and all the cycling have a tendency to move or rust out. So we will send you replacements, try to get it back on the 90-degree angle to where it rotates smoothly back and forth. Any questions on that? Any questions? Okay, we'll move forward with that. Like I said, with this, one thing that I want to present as we're looking at that, go back to that real quick, Brian. One of the things to do, and as you do your semi-annual maintenance or whatever, one of the greatest products in the world to have for a site operator, gum out. What we ask you to do a lot of times when weather permits in the spring, when you're coming out of a harsh winter or before you go into a harsh winter is to get some gum out. It's a carbon choke cleaner, and you spray it on the linkages of the underneath side of the motor box on your springs and stuff like that, and it allows it to rotate a little bit smoother. You know, do not use WD-40. The problem with WD-40 is it has a tendency to attract the dust and the dirt and the grease and the grime, all the things that we're trying to avoid. This is more of a cleaner product and serves better as a lubricant. So, any questions?
One question. Are the clips supposed to be tight against the counterweight?
The question is, are the clips supposed to be tight against the counterweight? And yes, making sure that you have the same amount of distance between the top and the bottom, and that the counterweight is right in the center. Then you have the clips on either side of that to hold that counterweight in place. If for some reason that's moved, what's more than likely to happen is it gets to a certain point in making the rotation from open to close, and that's where you get the hang up at. And that's it. That counterweight weighs about 4 or 5 pounds. So when it's moved and it's off center, then it's going to basically cause the bending of those drive rods. Hope that answered your question. Yeah. Real quick, I'm going to go back to the slides real quick.
Yeah, here's the clutch.
I'll let Chris kind of explain it. This is a picture of the clutch, and the way the clutch more or less works, or I'll explain it. Go back to the camera real quick, and I'll explain it. What happens is this, there's a tooth that's in the side of this nodule right here, and what happens is the spring will move away. When your collector lid moves away, it moves away from the nodule, and then this turns, kind of like the cycling of the collector. When the collector gets to a certain point, then the tooth of this round mechanism right here locks in with the tooth from the spring right there, and that's when the collector will close and be locked down. Now, if we were to knock this out away from the tooth, what happens is there's nothing to grab the collector to be able to move it back and forth. So that's why you have all the freedom of being able to take it back and forth. When the collector has had an opportunity to cycle, then it's going to catch that tooth once again and move it back to where it should be. You can take it out of gear. A lot of times if you have something that's incurred, when the collector is out of gear, then it basically is not going to show any sort of power to be able to open and close. That's why I may ask you, and you heard it pop in, is I may ask you to take your hand and put it on the gear or on the clutch of the side of the motor box and move it ever so slightly till you hear it pop into that particular gear, in which, in essence, once it's in that particular gear right there, then it restores the power and allows it to move back and forth.
And this is also, we talk about bulk mode sampling. What you can do is slip it out, and then at this point, unplug the collector such that the wet side bucket's always open. We call that bulk mode sampling. And as you can see, when it slips back in, it'll just go back. So you could put it in the bulk mode, and then you could go ahead and remove your motor box or that. And again, call us for guidance on when that would be advised.
Yeah. But when Chris was talking about the bulk mode, that's previous to when we do send you the new motor box. If you've discovered that nothing's happening or anything like that, then just bungee it down. It's one of the things that's kind of handy to keep about in an Aerochem is to have a bungee cord to, if you do incur a problem, instead of losing the potential for a sample, to be able to bungee this open, expose the wet side at all times, and to at least collect a sample. Any questions? Question, are the clips supposed to be tight? Okay, we've got that one. To clarify, in the picture, the clips aren't flush against the counterweight.
Oh, yeah. Astute observation. Yeah, there's in that picture. A little play is okay. The basic idea is that those clips are there to hold the counterweight in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, especially for that one.
Here's your sensor.
Okay, our next step is now we got the motor box changed. Let's go to the sensor replacement. Chris talked about this being a real easy thing to do. There's 4 screws. You unplug it from the motor box. Items needed: a replacement grid sensor, medium-sized straight blade screwdriver, medium-sized Phillips head screwdriver, and your field observer report form where you can make notes once you get back to the laboratory. But what you're going to do is we've got our new sensor here. Yeah, we want the camera at this point.
All right. The sensor replacement is pretty straightforward. Again, you just unscrew it. You can refer to the diagram. It's just got a simple screw type connector. You can unscrew it. We'll do a close-up of that in just a minute. We'll show that. We'll show how we take it off the collector. I realize the view isn't that good, but we'll show a close-up of the motor box of where it goes in. I realize these connections can get corroded with time, so it can take a little bit of effort. Do your best to just use your hand. If you absolutely have to, an adjustable wrench is okay to loosen it, but you want to make sure. Sometimes that can deform. It's kind of a light metal. It can make things worse.
And we'll talk about too. And if there's any questions, is something that we're not showing visually, the shortcut to the replacement for the sensor replacement SOP. You'll see exactly what we're talking about. We just wanted to try to go live and give you a version of, how important it really is.
There's 4 screws on the top of the collector. You just simply remove those and retain them. If you happen to lose any, we can send you replacements, no problem. But your replacement sensor usually doesn't have them. In the short term, it's okay if you're missing 1 or 2. Just call us and we'll get your replacements. We realize, again, field conditions always pose a challenge. So again, we've determined the sensor's bad. We'd refer you back to our previous webinars that talk about troubleshooting those. And just remove it. A screw is always a challenge.
Screws and the cannon plug, they're in there forever. It can't.
Yeah.
Got to hold up against the elements. So Chris has the old one off.
Before we put the new one on, let's show a close-up of that connection. Why don't you hand me that motor box that we just took off? I'll hold this here.
Oh, colleague will hold you.
So this is the connection we're talking about. It sort of looks like a microphone connection there, and it's just a simple 4-pin connector. You'll notice there's a notch in the bottom. That's at the bottom of the connector. So you'll thread this in through the top of the collector. That fits into the hole. And then what I'm rotating is the outer collar, so you're going to get a good snug fit. And then go ahead and screw it down. In rare instances, we might advise you to use some contact cleaner on that. Over the years, all this equipment's aging. We realize that. We're doing our best to get the longevity, because none of it's being made anymore. So you may want to use a little bit of contact cleaner in there. That can get corroded, but we'd advise you when to do this. And then this is just a close-up of the fuses and the connections there. We'll refer you back to the diagram and our previous troubleshooting on how to handle that. So the new sensor comes with a tag. Obviously, remove that.
One of the things that we haven't talked about too, and what we just talked about, was the plug assembly for the sensor. That goes a long way in there, and those female contacts have to make contact with the male contacts in order to get the signal. And a lot of times in a replacement, if you don't get that in there all the way, you get intermittent switching.
Go ahead and install the new sensor, and you want it to be pointed away. If you know the orientation, it's pointing away from the dry side bucket, so away from your camera view. You simply thread the cable into the hole in the top, and then there's 4 screws to retain it on the top of the collector mainframe. So they're held in place. And then I'm going to go ahead and plug the sensor wire in.
One of the things to be careful of too is when you're plugging that sensor in, we initially plugged our AC power back in to make sure that the motor box was working. We'll probably want to unplug the AC power before we connect the sensor into the motor box, because that is a live wire, and I've had it happen to me where I've gotten bit a little bit by the power.
We'll verify the collector operation again with water, and it should operate. If it doesn't, one thing to be aware of, the sensor should heat. As Jeff's noted, precautions when it's live, but one thing, if you do remove the sensor wire at this point, it does cause the collector to cycle back. So that's one way we can check cycling. At this point, if things don't operate, we may advise you to just check the incoming power, bring something that can verify the incoming power, verify your solar, verify voltages at the box. And again, we can provide further guidance if you need in that area. That's pretty much it with the sensor. If you want to cover anything else.
What about the event recorder?
The event recorder, when disconnecting the wires for the event recorder on the face of the motor box, if we could go back to the camera real quick, Brian, I'll show them on this one. Okay. When you disconnect your event recorder wires on your Aerochem, on the new electronic gauges, always remember that the top is positive and the bottom is negative. So when using the old Belfort, polarity didn't necessarily matter, but we moved to the E gauges, and polarity does matter. So always remember top positive, bottom negative.
Yeah, so at this point, we would reestablish all of our connections for the event recorder, backup battery, what have you. And essentially it's finished. You can dry off the sensor, verify it operates. And at this time, you'd want to go ahead and put on your clean bucket for your new week, for your new sampling period. Probably clean the lid seal and go ahead and replace your dry side bucket with one with a cleaned lid as part of your monthly maintenance. And you should be good to go. Go ahead and note what you did on your field form, especially if there's a gap between samples. So we do like to know about gaps and periods. So just simply write on your field form that the motor box was changed, and then please ship the parts back to us for refurbishing, and so they can go on to other stations.
Any questions? Like I said, if we went too fast or you weren't able to quite see what you wanted to see, there's the two shortcuts on the grid sensor replacement for the Aerochem. That's the actual instructional memo that we send out to operators as an attachment in an email. When they do have to replace parts, they just refer to that if you have any questions. Are there any questions? Well, if there's no questions, I'd like to thank Dr. Chris Lehman, Director of the Central Analytical Laboratory, as well as my engineer, Brian Kirshner. My name is Jeffrey Pribble. I can be reached at 1-800-952-7353, or the email address that you see at the bottom of this one, ntn@isws.illinois.edu. If you have not seen any of our webinars before, they can be accessed on page 1 at the goillinois.edu/NADP training. We thank you very much for your continued service to the NADP network. On behalf of all of us, happy Veterans Day.